My name is Eliza, and I have spent 18 years of my life in the grand kitchen of the Thornfield Mansion on East Bay Street in Charleston, creating feasts for people who would rather see me dead than acknowledge my humanity. The year 1835 found me bent over copper pots and cast iron skillets, my hands scarred from countless burns and cuts, my back aching from hours spent standing over fires that seemed to mirror the burning rage in my heart. The Thornfield estate was one of Charleston's most prestigious addresses, a 3-story mansion built with rice plantation money and maintained through the labor of more than 40 enslaved souls. Master Richard Thornfield had inherited both the house and most of us from his father, along with a taste for luxury that demanded the finest food, the most elaborate entertaining, and the kind of ostentatious display that reminded everyone of his place in Charleston's rigid social hierarchy. I had been born in 1802 in the slave quarters behind the mansion, delivered by the same woman who had cooked for the Thornfields before me. My mother, Grace, had trained me from childhood in the art of preparing the complex French cuisine that Master Thornfield preferred, teaching me techniques that had been passed down through generations of enslaved cooks who understood that their survival depended on their ability to satisfy the refined palates of their oppressors. "Remember, child," my mother would whisper to me as we worked side by side in those early years, "they may own our bodies, but in this kitchen, we hold power they don't even understand. The food we prepare enters their bodies, becomes part of them. That's a sacred trust and a dangerous one." At the time, I thought she meant only that we could poison them if we chose to, a fantasy that many enslaved people cherished during moments of particular cruelty or humiliation. But as I grew older and more skilled in my craft, I began to understand that she meant something deeper and more profound. Food was intimacy forced upon us. We nourished the bodies of people who viewed us as less than human, sustained the strength of those who used that strength to oppress us. The Thornfield kitchen was a marvel of efficiency and sophistication, equipped with the latest innovations that Master Thornfield's wealth could provide. We had a massive cast iron range imported from Philadelphia, copper pots crafted by the finest metalworkers in Charleston, and access to ingredients that came from all over the world through the city's bustling port. Spices from India, wines from France, sugar from the Caribbean plantations where people who looked like me died cutting cane under the tropical sun. But for all its grandeur, the kitchen was also a place of profound suffering. While I prepared elaborate meals that could feed 20 people in luxury, my own children received scraps barely sufficient to keep them alive. The irony was so bitter, it left a constant taste of ashes in my mouth. I, who could create dishes that brought tears of joy to the eyes of Charleston's elite, could not provide adequate nutrition for my own flesh and blood. I had 4 children, each born into the same bondage that had defined my existence since birth. There was Samuel, my eldest at 15, already working in the rice fields that funded the Thornfield luxury. Then came Mary, 13 years old and assigned to the house as a cleaning girl under the watchful eye of Mistress Thornfield. My daughter Ruth, 11, helped me in the kitchen when she wasn't tending to the garden that provided vegetables for the master's table. Finally, there was little James, only 8 years old, but already showing signs of the intelligence that might someday make him valuable as a house servant. Their father was a field hand named Thomas, who had been sold to a plantation in Georgia when James was barely walking. Master Thornfield had decided that Thomas was becoming too familiar with the house servants, meaning that he had dared to show affection for his family in ways that made the white folks uncomfortable. One morning, Thomas was simply gone, loaded onto a wagon with a handful of other troublesome slaves, and shipped away to pick cotton under an even more brutal overseer. I never saw him again, never learned whether he survived the change or died missing the children he would never be allowed to raise. His absence left a hole in all our lives that could never be filled, but it also planted seeds of hatred in my heart that grew stronger with each passing day. The daily routine of the Thornfield kitchen began before dawn and ended long after the family had finished their evening entertainment. I would rise at 4 o'clock to start the fires and begin preparations for breakfast, which had to be ready precisely at 8 when Master Thornfield came down from his chambers. Every meal was an elaborate production that required hours of preparation and perfect timing. Eggs that had to be gathered from our own chickens at just the right moment, bread that had to be baked fresh each morning, meat that had to be prepared according to techniques I had learned from French cookbooks that I read in secret. Breakfast was followed immediately by preparations for the midday meal, which was often served to business associates or social visitors who came to discuss rice prices, politics, or the latest gossip from Charleston society. These meals required even more sophistication. Multiple courses, fine wines, desserts that demonstrated my mastery of pastry techniques that few cooks in the city could match. But it was the evening meals that truly showcased both my skills and the cruel contradiction of my existence. Master Thornfield loved to entertain, hosting dinner parties that might include a dozen of Charleston's most prominent families. These gatherings required preparation that began days in advance, with elaborate planning of menus, coordination with merchants for the finest ingredients, and execution that demanded perfection in every detail. I would spend entire days preparing a single evening's entertainment, creating dishes that represented hours of labor and years of accumulated knowledge. Turtle soup made from creatures caught in Charleston Harbor, roasted fowl stuffed with exotic ingredients and served with sauces that required delicate balance of flavors, elaborate desserts that were works of art as much as food, designed to impress guests with both their beauty and their complexity. And through it all, my own children received table scraps and leftover cornbread, their growing bodies sustained on the same basic rations provided to field hands who performed back-breaking labor under the South Carolina sun. The contrast was so stark, so fundamentally wrong, that it filled me with a rage that grew more intense with each feast I prepared for people who would have sold my children without a moment's hesitation if the price was right. Mistress Catherine Thornfield was perhaps the cruelest aspect of my daily existence. She was a woman of 35 who had been raised in luxury and had never performed a day of honest labor in her life, yet she felt qualified to critique every aspect of my cooking and to punish me for any perceived shortcoming in the meals I prepared. She would sweep into the kitchen without warning, her silk skirts rustling with self-importance, and find fault with everything from the temperature of the soup to the presentation of the vegetables. "Eliza," she would say, in that honey-sweet voice that barely concealed her contempt, "the sauce for last night's fish was far too salty." I was embarrassed in front of Mrs. Pemberton, who specifically commented on it. "You simply must pay more attention to these details, or I'll have to ask Master Thornfield to find a cook who can meet our standards." The threat was always implicit, but never far from the surface. I could be sold at any time, separated from my children, and sent to work in conditions that might be far worse than what I currently endured. This knowledge hung over every interaction, every criticism, every moment of my existence in the Thornfield household. But Mistress Thornfield's cruelty went beyond simple threats. She seemed to take genuine pleasure in reminding me of my place, in emphasizing the vast gulf between her comfortable existence and my bondage. She would describe in elaborate detail the meals she had enjoyed while visiting friends in other cities, comparing them favorably to my cooking and suggesting that perhaps I needed additional training or should be replaced with someone more competent. "You know, Eliza," she said to me one afternoon as I prepared vegetables for the evening meal, "Mrs. Ravenel's cook in Savannah prepares the most exquisite oyster dishes. Perhaps I should arrange for you to spend some time there, learning proper techniques from someone who truly understands fine cuisine." She knew, of course, that such an arrangement would mean separation from my children, possibly permanently. She knew that the threat would terrify me more than any physical punishment could. And she knew that by dangling this possibility over my head, she could ensure my complete compliance with her every whim and demand. The children who lived in the slave quarters understood their situation with the cruel clarity that comes to young people who have never known anything but oppression. They accepted their hunger as normal, their constant labor as expected, their complete lack of prospects as simply the way the world worked. But I could see in their eyes the gradual dying of hope, the slow acceptance of degradation that would eventually make them into the kind of broken adults that slavery was designed to create. Samuel, my oldest, had already begun to show signs of the bitter resignation that characterized most field hands. He worked from dawn to dusk in the rice fields, his young body pushed to its limits by overseers who cared nothing for his age or his potential. When he came home in the evenings, he was too exhausted to do anything but eat whatever scraps I could provide and fall into the deep sleep of someone whose spirit was being systematically crushed. Mary, working in the house, was exposed to daily humiliations that cut deeper than physical labor ever could. She was constantly reminded of her inferior status, required to avert her eyes when speaking to white people, forbidden to sit down in their presence, treated like a piece of furniture that happened to be capable of cleaning and serving. I could see the spark of intelligence in her eyes slowly dimming as she learned to make herself invisible, to anticipate needs without being asked, to accept insults and commands with the blank expression that white folks interpreted as contentment. Ruth, still young enough to work primarily in the kitchen with me, maintained some of her natural curiosity and energy, but I knew that this would change as she grew older and her value as property became more apparent to the Thornfields. Already, I had noticed Master Thornfield watching her with the calculating gaze of someone assessing potential rather than seeing a human being. The thought of what might await her as she matured filled me with a terror that kept me awake during the few hours when I was supposed to be resting. Little James, despite his youth, was already showing signs of the intelligence that might someday make him valuable as a house servant. He absorbed everything around him like a sponge, learning to read by watching me study recipe books, picking up fragments of languages from the international guests who visited the Thornfield mansion. But I knew that his intelligence would also make him dangerous in the eyes of white people who preferred their slaves to be ignorant and compliant. As the months passed, and I watched my children growing up in bondage, accepting degradation as their natural state, I felt something hardening inside me that was far more dangerous than simple anger or resentment. I began to understand that the system that enslaved us was not just cruel but fundamentally evil, designed to destroy human souls as well as human bodies. And I began to contemplate actions that went far beyond the petty revenge fantasies that most slaves used to cope with their daily suffering. The breaking point came in the winter of 1834, when little James fell seriously ill with a fever that threatened to kill him. I begged Mistress Thornfield to allow me to call a doctor, to provide the medicine that might save his life, to show even the basic compassion that any human being deserved when facing death. Her response was a dismissive wave of her hand and a reminder that slaves who couldn't work weren't worth the expense of medical care. "If the boy dies, Eliza, you can have another one. It's not as if he's irreplaceable." Those words echoed in my mind for weeks afterward, crystallizing everything that was wrong with the world we lived in. To Catherine Thornfield, my child was nothing more than a potential economic loss, no different from a horse or a cow that might need to be replaced if it stopped being useful. The fundamental denial of his humanity, of his right to live and love and dream, was so complete that she could speak of his potential death as casually as she might discuss replacing a broken piece of kitchen equipment. James survived, but the experience changed something fundamental in my relationship with the Thornfield family. I began to see them not as cruel masters who might be placated or reasoned with, but as enemies who represented everything evil about the system that enslaved us. And I began to plan their destruction with the same methodical care that I brought to preparing their elaborate meals. The plan that took shape in my mind over the following months was elegantly simple in its conception, but devastating in its potential execution. I would use my greatest skill, my ability to create foods that they trusted and desired, to deliver a justice that the law would never provide. I would prepare a feast that would give them exactly what they deserved for their cruelty, their greed, and their complete denial of our humanity. As winter gave way to spring in 1835, as the social season approached its peak and the Thornfields began planning their most elaborate entertainment of the year, I smiled for the first time in months. They wanted a feast that would impress Charleston society, demonstrate their wealth and sophistication, and provide them with the social standing that their money had purchased. I would give them exactly what they asked for, but this time, the meal would be prepared with ingredients they had never imagined, seasoned with justice they had never tasted, and served with a garnish of retribution that would transform their moment of triumph into something far different. The kitchen that had been my prison for 18 years would become my arsenal, and the skills that had made me valuable as property would make me dangerous as a human being who had finally decided to fight back. The spring of 1835 brought with it news that would provide the perfect opportunity for the plan that had been taking shape in my mind throughout the long, dark months of winter. Master Thornfield announced that he would be hosting the most elaborate dinner party in the mansion's history to celebrate his recent appointment to the Charleston Harbor Commission, a position that would significantly increase both his wealth and his social standing. "Eliza," he said to me one morning as I served his breakfast, This dinner must be absolutely perfect. We'll be entertaining Judge Morrison, Senator Calhoun's business partner, the mayor, and at least a dozen of the most important families in Charleston. Everything must reflect the sophistication and refinement that our position in society demands. Yes, master, I replied, my voice carrying the same respectful tone I had perfected over years of necessary deception. How many guests should I plan for? 16 for dinner, including Mrs. Thornfield and myself. The ladies will retire to the parlor afterward, so plan for appropriate refreshments there as well. And Eliza, he paused, fixing me with the stern gaze he used when he wanted to emphasize his authority. This evening will be scrutinized by people whose opinions matter greatly to our family's future. Any mistakes will reflect poorly on all of us. The threat was clear, though wrapped in the language of shared responsibility that white folks used when they wanted to make their slaves complicit in their own oppression. If the dinner was a success, Master Thornfield would receive all the credit for his excellent household management. If anything went wrong, I would bear the full responsibility and punishment for failing to meet his expectations. But what Master Thornfield didn't understand was that I was no longer the compliant cook who had spent years trying to avoid his anger and earn his approval. The woman standing before him was someone entirely different, someone who had watched her children starve while preparing feasts for his family, someone who had been denied basic medical care for her sick child, someone who had reached the point where death seemed preferable to continued submission. I understand completely, Master, I said. This will be a dinner that none of your guests will ever forget. The truth of those words brought me the first genuine satisfaction I had felt in months. This would indeed be a dinner that would be remembered for generations, though not for the reasons that Master Thornfield expected. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into planning the menu with an intensity that surprised even Mistress Thornfield, who was accustomed to my dedication but had never seen me quite so focused on a single event. I spent hours studying cookbooks, experimenting with new techniques, and researching ingredients that could be obtained through Charleston's extensive network of merchants and ship captains. The menu I developed was a masterpiece of culinary sophistication that would demonstrate every skill I had acquired over 18 years of forced labor in the Thornfield kitchen. There would be turtle soup prepared from creatures caught fresh in Charleston Harbor, served with delicate pastry garnishes that required hours of intricate work. The main course would feature multiple preparations of the finest meats available: roasted duck with cherry sauce, lamb prepared in the French style with herbs and wine, and fresh fish caught that very morning and prepared with techniques that few cooks in America could master. But it was the dessert course that would truly showcase my abilities, and it was here that I planned to embed the special ingredient that would transform this celebration into something very different from what my masters expected. I would prepare an elaborate Charlotte Russe, a molded dessert made with ladyfinger cookies, Bavarian cream, and exotic fruits that would serve as the centerpiece of the evening's conclusion. The beauty of my plan lay in its invisibility. The ingredient I intended to use would be completely undetectable by taste, smell, or appearance, but would produce effects that would begin slowly and build to an inevitable and irreversible conclusion. My victims would enjoy every bite of their meal, compliment the chef, and retire to their homes feeling satisfied and successful, never knowing that they had just consumed the instruments of their own destruction. The ingredient I had chosen was oleander, a beautiful flowering plant that grew wild throughout the Charleston area and was commonly used in decorative gardens. Every part of the plant contained cardiac glycosides that were deadly to humans in even small amounts, but the effects could be delayed for hours or even days, depending on the quantity consumed and the preparation method. I had been experimenting with oleander preparations for months, using stray cats and dogs to test different concentrations and methods of extraction. Through careful observation, I had learned exactly how much would produce the effects I desired: a slow, agonizing death that would begin with nausea and progress through increasing cardiac distress until the victim's heart simply stopped beating. The process of extracting the toxic compounds from oleander leaves required careful technique and considerable patience. I would need to dry the leaves slowly to concentrate the active ingredients, then powder them finely enough to incorporate into the cream that would form the base of the Charlotte Russe. The entire process would need to be conducted in complete secrecy, with no possibility of accidental exposure that might harm my own children or the other slaves who worked in the kitchen. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of my preparation was the psychological weight of what I was planning. I had never killed another human being, had never even contemplated murder, until the events of the previous winter had pushed me beyond the point where I valued my own safety above the possibility of justice. Now I was planning to kill not just one person, but an entire gathering of Charleston's social elite, people whose deaths would send shockwaves through the entire system that kept people like me in bondage. The weight of this decision kept me awake during the few hours when I was supposed to be resting, but it also filled me with a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before. For 18 years, I had been a victim of circumstances beyond my control, a woman whose life was defined entirely by other people's needs and desires. Now, for the first time, I was taking action that would change the world around me in ways that those other people could never have imagined. Ruth, my 11-year-old daughter, noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. "Mama," she said to me one evening as we cleaned the kitchen after the day's cooking, "you seem different lately, like you're planning something important." I looked at this child who had inherited my intelligence along with my bondage, and I felt a surge of love mixed with determination that threatened to bring tears to my eyes. Everything I was planning was for her, for all my children, for all the children who would grow up in slavery if something wasn't done to change the fundamental nature of the world we lived in. "I am planning something important, Ruth," I told her quietly. "Something that might make life better for people like us, but it's also something that could be very dangerous, so you must never speak of it to anyone." She nodded solemnly, understanding without being told that we lived in a world where even children had to keep secrets that could mean the difference between life and death. "Will it help Samuel and Mary and James?" "I hope so, baby. I hope it will help all of us." The other slaves in the Thornfield household began to notice changes as well, though none of them could have guessed the true nature of what I was planning. Big Jim, who worked in the stables, commented that I seemed more focused than usual, more purposeful in my movements. Sarah, who helped with the laundry, mentioned that I was spending more time alone, often disappearing for hours at a time when my kitchen duties were complete. What they didn't know was that I was using those disappearances to gather the oleander leaves I would need for my preparation, carefully collecting them from gardens throughout Charleston during the early morning hours when the streets were empty and no one would witness my activities. I would dry the leaves in a hidden corner of the root cellar, grind them to powder using a mortar and pestle that I kept concealed beneath loose floorboards, and gradually accumulate the quantity I would need to poison 16 people. The technical challenge of incorporating the oleander powder into the Charlotte Russe required weeks of experimentation and careful calculation. The cream base would need to be prepared with exact proportions to ensure that every serving contained a lethal dose while maintaining the delicate flavor and texture that the dessert required. Too much powder, and the taste would be noticeably bitter. Too little, and the effects would be unreliable. I finally settled on a preparation method that would incorporate the oleander powder into sweetened cream that had been infused with vanilla and rum, creating a mixture that would completely mask any unusual flavors while delivering precisely the dosage I intended. The powder would be mixed into individual portions of cream as they were assembled, ensuring that each guest received exactly the amount needed to achieve the desired result. But the most difficult aspect of my preparation was maintaining the facade of normalcy while planning mass murder. I had to continue preparing daily meals for the Thornfield family, managing the kitchen staff, and responding to Mistress Thornfield's constant criticisms and demands, all while hiding the true nature of what I was planning for their grand celebration. "Eliza," Mistress Thornfield said to me one afternoon as I worked on perfecting the recipe for the turtle soup, "you seem remarkably dedicated to this dinner preparation. I hope you understand how important this evening is for our family's reputation." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, stirring the soup with movements that had become automatic over years of practice. "I want everything to be perfect for Master Thornfield's celebration." "Good, because Judge Morrison's wife is known throughout Charleston for her sophisticated palate, and Senator Whitman has dined in the finest restaurants in Paris. If our dinner doesn't meet their standards, it will reflect poorly on all of us." The irony of her words was almost overwhelming. Here was a woman who had denied medical care to my dying child, who treated my family like livestock, who had never shown the slightest consideration for our humanity, expressing concern about impressing people who were fundamentally no different from herself. They were all part of the same system, all complicit in the same fundamental evil, all deserving of the same fate. "I understand completely, Ma'am," I said. "This will be a meal that will establish a new standard for Charleston society." As the date of the dinner approached, I found myself studying the faces of my intended victims with new intensity, memorizing their features so that I would remember exactly who had been eliminated when my plan reached its conclusion. Master Thornfield, with his soft hands and cruel smile, who had sold my children's father to satisfy a moment of pique. Mistress Thornfield, whose casual cruelty had become the defining feature of my daily existence. The guests who would come to celebrate wealth built on human suffering, people who viewed slavery as natural and inevitable. All of them would consume my cooking with the same appetite they had always shown, never suspecting that the woman they had dismissed as property was capable of the kind of systematic revenge that would transform their moment of triumph into their final meal. The night before the dinner, as I made my final preparations and reviewed every detail of my plan, I felt a calmness descend over me that I had not experienced since childhood. Tomorrow evening, 18 years of accumulated injustice would finally be balanced. Tomorrow evening, the Thornfield mansion would host a feast that would be remembered throughout Charleston society for generations to come. But most importantly, tomorrow evening would mark the end of my existence as a victim and the beginning of something entirely different, whether that was death, discovery, or some form of freedom I had never dared to imagine. The morning of May 15th, 1835, dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect Charleston weather that made the city's elite feel blessed by Providence and certain of their place in the natural order of things. But as I stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the Thornfield kitchen, beginning preparations for what would be the most important meal of my life, I felt neither blessed nor certain, only focused with the clarity that comes to people who have finally decided to act rather than simply endure. The dinner was scheduled for 7 o'clock that evening, which meant that I had approximately 14 hours to complete the most complex and dangerous cooking I had ever attempted. Every dish had to be perfect, every detail flawless, because any mistake that attracted unusual attention to the food might lead to discovery of what I had planned for the final course. I began with the turtle soup, a delicacy that required hours of careful preparation to extract maximum flavor from the creatures that had been caught fresh in Charleston Harbor the previous day. The turtles had to be cleaned and butchered with precision, their meat separated from shells and organs that would be used to create the rich stock that formed the foundation of the soup. It was bloody, demanding work that left my hands stained and my arms aching, but it was also familiar territory that allowed me to focus on the mechanical aspects of cooking while my mind rehearsed the more dangerous preparations that lay ahead. "Eliza," called Mistress Thornfield from the doorway of the kitchen, her silk dress pristine despite the early hour. "I want to review the menu one final time to ensure that everything meets our standards." "Yes, Ma'am," I replied, wiping my hands on my apron and turning to face the woman whose death I would orchestrate before the day was over. "Shall I list the courses for you?" "Please do. And remember that Judge Morrison's wife has very particular tastes, while Senator Whitman has dined extensively in Europe. Everything must be absolutely sophisticated." I recited the menu I had spent weeks perfecting, watching her face for any sign of suspicion or concern. "We'll begin with the turtle soup, served with pastry garnishes. The main course will feature roasted duck with cherry sauce, lamb prepared in the French style with herbs and wine, fresh fish with lemon butter, and vegetables from our own garden. For dessert, I've prepared a charlotte russe with imported fruits and cream." Her expression brightened with satisfaction as she visualized the impression such a meal would make on her guests. "Excellent. And the wines? Master Thornfield has selected bottles from our finest stock?" "Yes, ma'am. The wines have been chosen to complement each course perfectly." "Good. This evening must demonstrate that the Thornfield household represents the pinnacle of Charleston refinement. I trust you understand the importance of your role in creating that impression." "I understand completely, ma'am. Tonight's dinner will be unlike anything Charleston society has ever experienced." The double meaning of my words brought me a moment of dark satisfaction as she swept out of the kitchen to continue her preparations. If only she knew how accurate my prediction would prove to be. As the morning progressed, I moved through the familiar rhythms of large-scale cooking while keeping a careful eye on the other servants who would be helping with the dinner preparation. Ruth was assigned to assist me with vegetable preparation, her small hands perfect for the delicate work of trimming and arranging garnishes. 2 other kitchen maids, borrowed from neighboring households, would help with the multiple courses that needed to be ready simultaneously. The challenge was finding moments when I could work on the oleander preparation without being observed. The poisonous powder I had spent weeks creating was hidden in a small vial concealed beneath loose floorboards in the root cellar, but incorporating it into the Charlotte Russe would require absolute privacy and perfect timing. I had decided to add the oleander to individual portions of the cream as I assembled the dessert, rather than contaminating the entire batch, for 2 reasons. First, it would allow me to control exactly how much each person received, ensuring lethal doses without waste. Second, it would mean that if anyone in the kitchen accidentally tasted the dessert during preparation, they would not be harmed by my revenge. The turtle soup was finished by mid-morning, its rich flavor concentrated through hours of slow simmering and careful seasoning. I strained it through fine cloth to remove any particles that might affect its silky texture, then set it aside to be reheated just before serving. The pastry garnishes required another hour of delicate work, rolling dough thin as paper and cutting it into shapes that would float on the surface of each bowl like edible flowers. The main course preparations began immediately afterward, with the duck requiring special attention to achieve the perfect balance of crispy skin and tender meat that Master Thornfield preferred. I rubbed the birds with a mixture of herbs and spices that I had developed over years of experimentation, then set them to roast slowly while I turned my attention to the lamb. The French preparation that Mistress Thornfield had specifically requested was one of the most complex dishes in my repertoire, requiring the meat to be marinated overnight in wine and herbs, then braised slowly until it reached perfect tenderness. The sauce alone took 2 hours to prepare properly, combining the braising liquid with additional wine, stock, and carefully balanced seasonings that would complement the lamb without overwhelming its natural flavor. "Mama," Ruth said to me as we worked together preparing vegetables, "you seem nervous today. Is everything all right?" I looked at my daughter, this beautiful child who had inherited both my intelligence and my bondage, and felt my resolve strengthen rather than waver. Everything I was doing was for her future, for the possibility that she might grow up in a world where people who looked like us were treated as human beings rather than property. "I'm not nervous, baby," I told her quietly. "I'm just focused on making sure everything is perfect tonight. This is a very important dinner for the family." It was the truth, though not in the way she understood it. This dinner would indeed be crucially important for the Thornfield family. It would be their last. By early afternoon, I had reached the point where I needed to begin the most dangerous phase of my preparation. The Charlotte Russe required several hours to set properly, which meant that I had to incorporate the oleander powder into the cream and assemble the dessert while there was still enough time for it to firm up before serving. I sent Ruth to the garden to gather flowers for table decorations, giving me the privacy I needed to retrieve the vial of poison from its hiding place in the root cellar. My hands were steady as I climbed down into the cool darkness below the kitchen, but my heart was racing with the knowledge that I was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The vial felt heavier than it should have as I concealed it in the folds of my apron and returned to the kitchen. Inside was enough oleander powder to kill 20 people, concentrated through weeks of careful preparation into a substance that would be completely undetectable once mixed into the sweetened cream that formed the base of the Charlotte Russe. The cream had to be prepared with absolute precision, whipped to exactly the right consistency, and flavored with vanilla and rum in proportions that would mask any trace of the oleander's natural bitterness. I worked slowly and methodically, tasting the mixture repeatedly to ensure that it met the standards of perfection that Master Thornfield's guests would expect. When the cream reached the proper texture and flavor, I divided it into 18 individual portions, 16 for the guests, plus 2 extras in case of accidents during serving. It was then that I added the oleander powder, measuring it carefully into each portion with a precision that would have impressed any pharmacist. Too little and the effects would be delayed or unreliable. Too much and the bitter taste might be noticeable. I had calculated the exact amount needed to produce death within 24 hours, preceded by several hours of increasing distress that would initially be attributed to rich food and wine. The actual assembly of the Charlotte Russe was a work of art that required all the skill I had developed over 18 years of professional cooking. Ladyfinger cookies had to be arranged in perfect symmetry around the molds. The poisoned cream had to be poured and layered with exotic fruits imported specifically for this dinner, and the entire construction had to be stable enough to maintain its shape when unmolded for serving. As I worked on the final details of the dessert, I found myself thinking about my mother, who had trained me in these techniques when I was barely old enough to reach the work surface. She had taught me that cooking was both service and power, that the women who prepared food held a sacred trust that could be used for good or evil depending on their choices. "Remember, child," she had told me all those years ago, "in the kitchen, we hold power they don't even understand." Tonight, Master Thornfield and his guests would discover exactly what kind of power an enslaved cook could wield when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The Charlotte Russe was completed and moved to the cooling pantry by 4 o'clock, giving it 3 hours to set properly before serving. The timing was perfect. Enough time for the dessert to firm up, but not so long that anyone might sample it before the dinner began. With the most dangerous preparation completed, I turned my attention to the final details that would make this dinner memorable for reasons beyond the poisoned dessert. The duck needed to be basted and turned, the lamb required attention to ensure perfect tenderness, and the fish had to be prepared fresh just before serving to maintain its delicate texture. But perhaps most importantly, I needed to prepare myself psychologically for what was about to occur. In less than 3 hours, I would begin serving a meal that would result in the deaths of 16 people, including the man and woman who had owned my body for my entire adult life. The magnitude of what I was about to accomplish was both terrifying and exhilarating, a combination of emotions that left me feeling more alive than I had in years. As evening approached and the first guests began arriving at the Thornfield mansion, I made my final preparations with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting these routines. The turtle soup was reheated to the exact temperature that would showcase its rich flavor. The main courses were arranged on platters with artistic precision, and the wines were opened and allowed to breathe according to Master Thornfield's specific instructions. Through the kitchen windows, I could hear the sounds of Charleston society gathering for what they believed would be another pleasant evening of fine food and sophisticated conversation. They had no idea that they were assembling for their own funeral feast, that the woman they dismissed as property had prepared their final meal with the same care and attention to detail that she brought to every aspect of her craft. At precisely 7 o'clock, I began serving the dinner that would be remembered throughout Charleston for generations to come. The first course was served at exactly 7:15, as the 16 guests settled into their seats around the Thornfields' mahogany dining table, their faces glowing with anticipation and their conversation flowing as smoothly as the expensive wines that Master Thornfield had selected to accompany each course. The turtle soup was presented in fine china bowls, each portion garnished with delicate pastry flowers that floated on the surface like water lilies in a Charleston garden. Judge Morrison, a heavy-set man whose wealth came from investments in slave ships, lifted his spoon with the reverence of someone who understood that he was experiencing cuisine that few cooks in America could prepare. "Richard," he said to Master Thornfield after his first taste, "this is absolutely extraordinary. Your cook has outdone herself tonight." "Eliza has been with our family for many years," Master Thornfield replied, with the casual pride of someone discussing a prized possession. "She has a natural talent that we've been careful to cultivate. It's one of the advantages of maintaining proper discipline in one's household." I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, officially present to oversee the service, but actually savoring every word of praise for cooking that would be their last. They spoke about me as if I were not there, as if the person who had created their perfect meal was merely an extension of the kitchen equipment rather than a human being with thoughts and feelings and plans of her own. Mrs. Senator Whitman, an elegant woman whose husband had made his fortune in cotton speculation, dabbed at her lips with a linen napkin. "The flavor is so complex, so perfectly balanced. How do you achieve such richness in the stock?" Master Thornfield glanced at me expectantly, and I stepped forward with the practiced subservience that had kept me alive for 18 years. "The secret is in the slow preparation, ma'am. The turtles must be cooked very gently to extract all their flavor without making the meat tough." "Fascinating," she replied, though her tone suggested that the actual techniques were less important to her than the impression of sophistication that the dish created. "You're very fortunate, Catherine, to have such skilled help." Mistress Thornfield smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose superiority had been publicly acknowledged. "We believe in investing in quality throughout our household. It's one of the reasons why entertaining at Thornfield is always such a pleasure." As I supervised the clearing of the soup course and the presentation of the main dishes, I found myself studying the faces of my intended victims with new intensity. These were people who had built their wealth and status on the systematic oppression of human beings like me, who viewed slavery not as a moral evil, but as an economic necessity that justified any amount of cruelty in its defense. Judge Morrison had personally presided over trials that sentenced runaway slaves to brutal punishment or death. Senator Whitman had voted consistently to expand slavery into new territories, ensuring that future generations would suffer the same bondage that had defined my existence. The other guests were planters, merchants, and financiers whose comfortable lives depended entirely on the labor of people who would never be free to enjoy the fruits of their own work. The main course was received with even greater enthusiasm than the soup had been. The roasted duck was proclaimed perfectly crispy, the French-style lamb was praised for its sophisticated seasoning, and the fresh fish was declared the finest that any of the guests had ever tasted. Wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and creating the kind of convivial atmosphere that Master Thornfield had hoped to achieve. "Richard," said Colonel Pemberton, whose rice plantation employed more than 300 slaves, "you must share the secret of your success in managing such a large household. The efficiency here is remarkable. The key is understanding that strict discipline produces the best results," Master Thornfield replied, cutting into his lamb with obvious satisfaction. "These people need firm guidance to reach their potential. Too much leniency, and they become lazy and unreliable." "Absolutely correct," agreed Mayor Hutchinson, whose own household included more than 20 enslaved servants. "The natural tendency is toward indolence unless properly supervised, but with appropriate management, they can achieve remarkable things." They spoke about slave management as if it were a science, discussing techniques for maximizing productivity while minimizing costs, comparing strategies for punishment and reward, sharing advice about which types of work were best suited to different ages and temperaments. The casual dehumanization of their conversation was so complete that they might have been discussing livestock or farm equipment rather than human beings. But what struck me most forcefully was their absolute certainty in the righteousness of their position. These were not people who had doubts about the morality of slavery or who felt any guilt about the suffering they inflicted. They viewed themselves as benevolent masters, providing guidance to an inferior race that could never survive without their protection and direction. The abolitionists in the North simply don't understand the realities of managing these people, declared Mrs. Judge Morrison, her voice rising with indignation. "They imagine that freedom would benefit the slaves, but we know better. Left to their own devices, they would starve or resort to crime. We provide them with security, purpose, and moral guidance that they could never achieve independently." "Exactly right," echoed Mistress Thornfield. "Our slaves are like children who need constant supervision and care. It would be cruel to abandon them to fend for themselves in a world they're not equipped to understand." As I listened to this conversation, feeling the familiar rage building in my chest, I reminded myself that justice was already being served. Every bite of food they consumed, every sip of wine they enjoyed, brought them closer to the moment when their casual cruelty would be repaid with interest. They had no idea that the woman serving their meal had already delivered their sentence, that the very excellence of the food they praised was proof of intelligence and skill that contradicted every assumption they held about the people they enslaved. The main course was cleared away as the guests settled back in their chairs, pleasantly full and slightly intoxicated, their faces flushed with wine and satisfaction. The conversation had moved from slave management to politics, with passionate discussions of tariff policies and territorial expansion that would determine the future of slavery throughout America. "The question," Senator Whitman was saying, "is whether we have the political will to defend our way of life against Northern interference. They seek to impose their misguided morality on institutions they don't understand, threatening the economic foundation of Southern prosperity. We must be prepared to take any necessary action to preserve our rights," Judge Morrison replied gravely. "The federal government has no authority to dictate how we manage our property or conduct our affairs within our own states." It was at this moment that I made my entrance with the final course, carrying the Charlotte Russe that would serve as both the culmination of the evening's culinary achievement and the instrument of my long-awaited revenge. The dessert was a masterpiece of visual presentation, molded into perfect symmetry and decorated with imported fruits that caught the candlelight like jewels. "Oh my," breathed Mrs. Whitman, "how absolutely beautiful. Catherine, your cook has truly created a work of art. It's almost too lovely to eat," added Colonel Pemberton's wife, though she was already reaching for her spoon with obvious anticipation. Master Thornfield stood to offer a toast as I began serving individual portions of the Charlotte Russe, each one containing exactly the amount of oleander powder needed to achieve the effects I desired. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his wine glass, "to an evening of friendship, prosperity, and the continuation of the traditions that make Charleston the jewel of the South." "Hear, hear," chorused the guests, lifting their own glasses before turning their attention to the dessert that I was placing before them with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what I was accomplishing. The first taste brought expressions of pure delight from every guest. The cream was perfectly smooth, the flavors expertly balanced, the texture exactly what such an elaborate dessert required. They ate with the enthusiasm of people who understood that they were experiencing something exceptional, something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. "Eliza," Mistress Thornfield called to me as I stood watching from my position near the dining room door, "this dessert is absolutely sublime. You've exceeded even our highest expectations." "Thank you, Ma'am," I replied, allowing a note of genuine satisfaction to enter my voice. "I wanted this evening to be perfect for Master Thornfield's celebration." "It certainly is that," Judge Morrison agreed, scraping the last traces of cream from his plate. "I've dined in the finest restaurants in Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, but I've never tasted anything quite like this Charlotte Russe." As the guests finished their dessert and prepared to move to the parlor for brandy and cigars, I felt a profound sense of completion settling over me like a comfortable garment. The plan that had consumed my thoughts for months was now accomplished beyond my most optimistic expectations. Every guest had consumed a full portion of the poisoned dessert. The flavors had been perfect enough to avoid any suspicion, and the effects would begin to manifest themselves within hours. The cleanup that followed was routine work that I had performed countless times before, but tonight it felt different, like the closing ceremonies of a long and difficult campaign rather than simply the end of another dinner service. As I washed the fine china and crystal that had held my instruments of revenge, I thought about my children sleeping in the slave quarters, unaware that their world was about to change dramatically. By midnight, the last guest had departed, and the Thornfield family had retired to their chambers, all of them satisfied with the success of an evening that had accomplished everything they had hoped for in terms of social advancement and political networking. They went to sleep believing that they had hosted a perfect dinner party that would enhance their reputation throughout Charleston society. What they didn't know was that they had just consumed their final meal, prepared by a woman they had dismissed as property, but who had proven capable of a form of justice that the legal system would never provide. In a few hours, they would begin to experience the first symptoms of oleander poisoning: nausea, weakness, and cardiac irregularities that would gradually worsen until their hearts simply stopped beating. As I completed my kitchen duties and prepared to join my children in the slave quarters, I felt not guilt or fear, but a deep satisfaction that I had finally taken action rather than simply enduring whatever cruelties were inflicted upon me. For 18 years, I had been a victim of circumstances beyond my control. Tonight, I had become an agent of justice, a woman who had used her greatest skill to deliver consequences that matched the crimes committed against my family and my people. The Grand Thornfield mansion would soon become a house of mourning, but for me it would always be remembered as the place where I finally fought back against the system that had enslaved me. The kitchen that had been my prison for so many years had become my arsenal, and the skills that had made me valuable as property had made me dangerous as a human being who refused to remain a victim. Tomorrow would bring discovery, investigation, and probable execution, but tonight I fell asleep, not as a slave, but as a revolutionary who had struck a blow for justice that would be remembered long after my name was forgotten. The first scream came at 3 o'clock in the morning. piercing through the darkness of the Charleston night like a blade through silk. I had been lying awake in my narrow cot in the slave quarters, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion, waiting for the sounds that would confirm the success of my carefully orchestrated revenge. It was Mistress Thornfield's voice, raised in panic and confusion as she called for help from her chambers on the second floor of the mansion. Within minutes, the entire household was awake, servants running through corridors, someone sent to fetch the doctor, and Master Thornfield's voice joining his wife's in demands for answers to questions that no one yet understood how to ask. I rose from my bed and dressed quickly, knowing that as the household's cook I would be expected to assist with whatever crisis was unfolding. As I walked through the darkness toward the main house, I felt a calm satisfaction that I had not experienced since childhood. The plan that had consumed my thoughts for months was proceeding exactly as I had hoped, and justice was finally being served to people who had spent their lives inflicting suffering on others. The scene inside the mansion was one of barely controlled chaos. Mistress Thornfield was violently ill, her body racked with nausea and trembling that she couldn't control. Master Thornfield was experiencing similar symptoms, though he was trying to maintain his composure while demanding that someone explain what was happening to his family. "Send for Dr. Hammond immediately," he ordered one of the house servants, "and wake Judge Morrison. If this is some kind of epidemic, his family may be affected as well." But it wasn't necessary to send word to Judge Morrison's house. Before Dr. Hammond could arrive, messages began arriving from throughout Charleston's most prestigious neighborhoods, reporting that guests from the previous evening's dinner party were experiencing identical symptoms. Senator Whitman's wife was gravely ill. Colonel Pemberton had collapsed in his study. Mayor Hutchinson was asking for last rites. By dawn, it was clear that everyone who had attended the Thornfield dinner party was dying from the same mysterious ailment that had begun with violent nausea and was progressing rapidly to complete cardiovascular collapse. Dr. Hammond, who had arrived at the mansion within an hour of being summoned, was completely baffled by symptoms that seemed to suggest poisoning, but had no obvious source. "Richard," he said to Master Thornfield as he examined Mistress Thornfield's rapidly weakening pulse, "I need to know everything that was consumed at last night's dinner, every dish, every wine, every ingredient that might have caused this reaction." Master Thornfield, despite his own increasing distress, managed to provide a detailed account of the evening's menu. As he described each course, Dr. Hammond's expression grew more puzzled and concerned. Nothing in the meal seemed likely to produce the symptoms that were affecting the guests, and the fact that the servants who had helped prepare and serve the food were unaffected suggested that the problem was specific to the dining room rather than the kitchen. The only thing that all the affected parties consumed exclusively was the final dessert course, Dr. Hammond concluded after reviewing all the available information. "But I can't imagine what ingredient in a Charlotte Russe could produce such severe toxicity." It was at this point that I made my entrance into the sick room, carrying the tea and broth that had been requested to help ease the patient's suffering. As I stood beside the bed where Mistress Thornfield lay dying, I felt a profound sense of completion that I had never experienced before in my life. "Eliza," Master Thornfield said weakly, his own condition deteriorating rapidly. "Doctor, Hammond needs to know about the dessert you prepared last night. What ingredients did you use? Is there anything that might have caused this illness?" I looked down at this man who had owned my body for 18 years, who had sold my children's father to satisfy a moment of pique, who had denied medical care to my dying son, and I felt no sympathy for his suffering. "I used only the finest ingredients, Master," I replied calmly. "Fresh cream, imported vanilla, rum from the Caribbean, and fruits that were specially ordered for the occasion." "But there must be something," Dr. Hammond interjected desperately. "Some ingredient that could have been contaminated or improperly prepared. The symptoms are too severe and too consistent to be accidental." I met his gaze directly, and for the first time in my life, I allowed my true feelings to show in my expression. "Doctor, I followed the recipe exactly as I always do. Every ingredient was fresh and properly prepared. If the guests are ill, it's certainly not due to any mistake in my cooking." The word "mistake" carried a weight that Dr. Hammond couldn't have understood, but Master Thornfield, even in his weakened state, caught the subtle emphasis in my voice. His eyes widened as he began to comprehend what I was telling him, though his mind could barely process the implications of what he was hearing. "You," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "you did this deliberately." "I prepared a meal that gave your guests exactly what they deserved," I replied quietly. "Nothing more, nothing less." The revelation struck Master Thornfield like a physical blow, and he tried to raise himself from his bed to confront me directly. But the oleander in his system had progressed too far for any such effort, and he collapsed back onto his pillows with a gasp of pain and rage. "You poisoned us," he said, the words emerging as more of a statement than an accusation. "You murdered 16 people because of some perceived grievance." "I served justice to people who spent their lives destroying others," I corrected him. "You sold my husband to satisfy your whim. Your wife denied medical care to my dying child. All of you built your wealth on the suffering of people you refused to acknowledge as human beings. What I served you last night was simply the natural consequence of your own choices." Dr. Hammond stared at me in horror as he began to understand what had occurred. "What did you use? What poison did you put in the dessert? Does it matter?" I asked. "The effects are irreversible and your patients will be dead within hours regardless of what you do to help them. The only question now is what happens to me when this conversation becomes public knowledge." The answer to that question came sooner than any of us expected. Word of my confession spread through the mansion within minutes, and by the time the sun was fully up, Sheriff Coleman was at the door with a warrant for my arrest and shackles heavy enough to restrain someone they now understood to be extraordinarily dangerous. "Eliza Williams," he said as his deputies surrounded me in the kitchen where I had spent 18 years of my life, "you are under arrest for the murders of Richard and Catherine Thornfield and 14 of Charleston's most prominent citizens." "I understand," I replied calmly. "May I say goodbye to my children before you take me away?" The request was denied, of course. A woman who had successfully poisoned 16 people could not be trusted with access to anyone she might care about, and the authorities were taking no chances that I might have prepared additional doses of whatever toxin I had used for my revenge. As they led me from the Thornfield mansion in chains, I caught a glimpse of my children standing with the other slaves in the courtyard, their faces reflecting a mixture of terror and confusion as they tried to understand what was happening to their mother. Ruth, my 11-year-old daughter, broke away from the group and ran toward me, only to be stopped by one of the deputies who refused to allow any contact between us. "Mama!" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "What's happening? Where are they taking you?" I looked at this beautiful child who would now face an uncertain future without my protection, and I felt the only moment of regret I had experienced since beginning my campaign of revenge. But even that regret was tempered by the knowledge that I had struck a blow against the system that enslaved her, had proven that people like us were capable of resistance that could shake the foundations of the society that oppressed us. "Remember that you are more than they say you are," I called to her as the deputies forced me into the wagon that would carry me to jail. "Remember that no one can own your soul unless you give it to them. And remember that justice is always possible, even when it seems impossible." The trial that followed was a sensation that captured the attention of the entire South, drawing newspaper reporters from as far away as New York and London, who wanted to witness the proceedings against a slave woman who had successfully murdered some of Charleston's most prominent citizens. The courthouse was packed daily with spectators who came to see the person who had accomplished something that most people had never imagined possible. I was represented by a court-appointed attorney who made no serious effort to mount a defense, instead focusing on arguing that I was mentally unfit to stand trial due to the stresses of slavery. The prosecution presented a straightforward case based on my own confession and the physical evidence of oleander poisoning that Dr. Hammond had eventually identified through analysis of the victim's remains. When given the opportunity to speak in my own defense, I stood before the packed courtroom and delivered what I knew would be my final statement to the world that had enslaved me. 18 years ago, I began working in the Thornfield kitchen as a young woman who believed that if I served faithfully and well, I might eventually earn the respect and consideration that all human beings deserve. I spent nearly 2 decades creating beautiful meals for people who viewed me as nothing more than a sophisticated piece of equipment, who denied medical care to my dying child, who sold my husband to satisfy their momentary displeasure. The courtroom was silent as I spoke, with even the most hostile faces showing attention to words that few enslaved people had ever been allowed to speak in such a setting. I poisoned those people because they represented everything that is evil about the system that enslaves us. They were not innocent victims, but active participants in a machinery of oppression that destroys human souls as well as human bodies. What I did to them was not murder but justice. Delayed perhaps, but finally delivered by someone who refused to remain a victim. You will execute me for what I have done, and that is your right under laws designed to protect the wealth and comfort of people like my victims. But you cannot execute the idea that I have proven that enslaved people are capable of resistance, that we possess intelligence and determination, that you consistently underestimate, that the system of human bondage contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. My name is Eliza Williams, and I die not as a piece of property, but as a woman who chose to fight back against evil. Remember that when you sit down to meals prepared by enslaved hands. Remember that when you treat human beings as livestock. Remember that among those you oppress are people who dream of justice, and who may someday decide that the price of delivering it is worth paying. The verdict was delivered within 2 hours, guilty of mass murder, with the sentence of death by hanging to be carried out within a week. As they led me back to my cell to await execution, I felt not fear, but a strange sense of peace, as if I had finally accomplished something worthy of the life I had been given. The execution was scheduled for June 1st, 1835, in the public square of Charleston, designed to serve as a warning to slaves throughout the region about the consequences of rebellion. But in the days leading up to my death, something unexpected began to happen. Word of my story started to spread through the enslaved community like fire through dry grass, carried from plantation to plantation by field hands and house servants who understood the significance of what I had attempted. I became, in those final days, something I had never expected to be, a symbol of resistance, proof that even the most oppressed person could choose to fight back rather than accept degradation as their fate. The tale of the cook, who had used her skills to deliver justice to her oppressors, captured the imagination of enslaved people throughout the South, inspiring both fear and admiration in equal measure. On the morning of my execution, I walked to the gallows with my head held high, wearing the simple dress that had been provided for the occasion. The crowd that had gathered was larger than anyone had expected. Slaves who had been given permission to attend as a warning, free blacks who came to witness history, and white abolitionists who saw in my story confirmation of their beliefs about the fundamental evil of slavery. As I stood on the platform with the rope around my neck, I looked out at those assembled faces and felt a profound sense of completion. My individual act of rebellion had been small and ultimately unsuccessful in terms of changing the larger system that had enslaved me, but it had planted seeds in human hearts that might someday grow into something much larger than one woman's act of vengeance. "Any last words?" the sheriff asked, following the traditional protocol. I thought of my children, who would grow up without their mother but with the knowledge that she had refused to remain a victim. I thought of my mother, who had taught me that cooking was both service and power. I thought of all the enslaved women who had died in silence, their resistance unrecorded and unremembered. "My name is Eliza Williams," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "I lived for 33 years as a slave, but I die as a free woman who chose her own path. Remember that rebellion is always possible, even when the cost seems unbearable. Remember that no one can own your soul unless you give it to them. And remember that justice, once planted, can grow in the most unlikely soil." The execution proceeded as scheduled, but my story did not end with my death. It lived on in the whispered conversations of slave quarters throughout the South, in the coded songs of house servants who understood the power that existed in their skilled hands, in the growing network of people who refused to accept that human bondage was natural or inevitable. Years later, when the Great War finally came that would break the chains of slavery once and for all, some of those who fought for freedom would say that they had been inspired by the story of Eliza Williams, the cook who served justice as her final course and showed an entire generation that even the most powerless could choose to resist rather than submit. Eliza Williams lived for 33 years under the brutal system of American slavery, before taking her final stand against the institution that had stolen her family and denied her humanity. She was executed by hanging on June 1st, 1835, in the public square of Charleston, South Carolina, in a spectacle intended to discourage other acts of rebellion among the enslaved population. However, her story of culinary revenge continued to circulate throughout the Underground Railroad network and became one of many tales of resistance that helped fuel the growing abolitionist movement. The Thornfield mansion was sold at auction within 3 months of the mass poisoning, as no family member survived to inherit the property. The 16 victims of Eliza's carefully planned revenge included some of Charleston's most influential citizens, creating a power vacuum in the city's social and political hierarchy that took years to fill. Her children were sold to different plantations throughout South Carolina and Georgia, scattered to prevent any possibility of them carrying on their mother's legacy of resistance. Historical records suggest that Eliza's methods inspired at least a dozen similar incidents throughout the antebellum South, as word of her techniques spread through the enslaved community. While most of these subsequent acts of culinary sabotage were smaller in scale and less successful, they collectively contributed to a growing atmosphere of fear among slaveholders who began to question the loyalty of the people who prepared their food. The echoes of Eliza Williams's rebellion resonate through time, a stark reminder of the deadly power that skilled enslaved women wielded in the most intimate spaces of their oppressors' lives. If these untold stories of courage and vengeance inspire you, join our community. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of American slavery. Your support helps us keep these powerful narratives alive, ensuring that the voices of those who refuse to be silenced continue to inspire future generations in their own struggles for justice and freedom.